I think that I was actually selected or targeted at a very early age. I'm guessing that it probably happened starting when I was about 3 years old. That would have made it 1950. I think they targeted children who had a lot of potential. They wanted really bright children to experiment on. And the other common thread seems to be that the father was connected to the military, as mine had been. My father was a very damaged veteran of World War II, and he was a pedophile, and he was very abusive. Both the American and the Canadian governments, via the CIA, were conducting mind control experiments on children that started in the 40s, and I believe are continuing to this day. And I am a survivor of the experimentation. Something that has recently come to light in Canada are the claims by a woman named Dorothy Proctor, who was an inmate in Kingston Women's Prison in the 1960s. Dorothy was subjected to LSD and sensory deprivation experiments when she was 17 years old. Canada's involvement in the development and the research of brainwashing techniques to be used on its own citizens ultimately, I would think began as early as 1937 or 1938. Jim Bronskill, again from Southam News, wrote an article in late December of '97 describing the correspondence between Dr. George Estabrook from Colgate College in Upper State New York and Hamilton, New York, and Superintendent Bevan, who was the head of the RCMP for Canada in 1940. Based on the correspondence, Bevan and Estabrooks had had a dialogue prior to this letter being written, and Estabrooks had been invited to discuss creating Manchurian candidates basically for the Canadian government in Ottawa in 1940. In their correspondence, Estabrooks said he would simply need access to a hospital or an institution like that for a minimum of 1 week. And he would use hypnosis and other techniques to create dissociated personalities, multiple personalities, to create what became to be known as Manchurian candidates.
As far as I understand it, it came from the notion of people coming back from the Korean War, that they were totally different people and a totally different set of attitudes and things like this. They were, God help us, they were anti-American, if you can possibly anybody being that way. And the question is, what were they doing to their soldiers? They hadn't the faintest idea what they were doing. And so they thought maybe these kind of drastic measures like LSD and so on and so forth would do the trick. And so they investigated it. And of course the Americans didn't want to use their own population because of the political repercussions. And here was Ewan Cameron, who was very happy to use Canadian citizens when the CIA were very happy to do that.
Some of the most prominent psychiatrists, psychologists, people who were involved in neurological studies, and including some of the presidents of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, were involved in conducting these experiments on children. They used electricity, implants, a lot of experimental drugs were used, sensory deprivation was used.
And then there was a whole pile of stuff that was done in Winnipeg also in the 70s, where people were put in tanks. They put in wetsuits and put in tanks and everything was closed down and so on. But basically the kind of thing that they were looking for was how brain function changes and how we process information in these very extreme conditions.
A simple form of torture that they used on myself and on a lot of other children was the dislocation of your limbs. So they dislocated both your arms and your legs. And that was probably the simplest, easiest, and cheapest way to reinforce the notion that you were absolutely helpless and that you could do nothing physically to defend or protect yourself from what they were going to do to you. Because your mind would say, I have to lift up my arm, I want to hit or I want to strike. Or your mind would say to your legs, get up and run, we need to run. And all you would be, there would just be your torso and your head.
But are people manipulable? Yes. Can you get people to do things they might not otherwise want to do? Yes.
Being strapped down on a table, having electricity applied like to your vagina or to that area, having electricity applied to your spine.
If you want to sort of go one stage back and say, can you control behavior? The answer is yes, you can.
There was pedophilia involved as well. I think a lot of research people were blackmailed into taking part in experiments or into taking part in the cover-up because the children were used, we were used for pornography and pedophilia. And a really common occurrence was a scientist or a researcher who they needed to be involved or they needed to be complicit with them. He would find himself attending something. They would then drug him and he would find himself in bed with a child with a camera just like this one, documenting what was going on. So that we were used as children that way, complicitly.
I want to say, is there mind control? The answer is yes, there are ways in which behavior can be changed.